Hey everyone. We're starting exactly at 8 because we want to make sure we have all the time we need for the evening. So thank you everyone for coming. I'm Michal Becker, Eskenazi Becker. I'm the engagement coordinator at the Jewish Federation. And since I assume there are a few people here are not super familiar with the Jewish Federation, I'm just going to say one sentence. The Jewish Federation is the central voluntary communal organization of the Jewish community. And the topic of the evening is relevant to our work because it's very relevant to two important values, Jewish values. One is the value of education, and the second one is a Jewish value that kind of tells us to do our best or the best we can to make the world we're living in a little bit better. So thank you again for coming, and I want to thank our guests, Dr. Ricky Gibbs and Maribeth Knight, for willing to come here on Sunday evening, which, as we just said, it's not like an obvious request. And thank you, Ryan Balch, for willing to moderate this conversation. And since we're not like, I think not everyone is here, but we will be a big group. So please make sure that you stay muted. And if you have any question, just write it on the chat. I'm no longer accepting the things I cannot change. I am changing the things I cannot accept. This quote by Angela Davis has been the driving force behind Dr. Gibbs' passion to change lives through the power of great education. Dr. Ricky Gibbs earned his BS in elementary education and MED in administration and supervision from Tennessee State University. He then went to earn a Doctor of Education degree in organizational leadership and strategic change from Lipscomb University. He started his career teaching third grade at Paragon Mills Elementary in Nashville, Tennessee, for 4 years. He served as an assistant principal and principal in Metro Nashville Public Schools and now has the honor of currently leading the transformation work as principal of Warner Arts Magnet Elementary. Our second guest tonight is Maribeth Knight. Maribeth is a journalist who relocated to Nashville from Chicago, where she covered business, the economy, housing, crime, and transportation. She's the host of the Promise podcast. She has written for the New Yorker, and her writing has also appeared in the New York Times, the Oprah Magazine, Uten Reader, American Craft, Chicago Magazine, and the Chicago Reader. She was a 2016 winner of Peter Lisagor Award for her education coverage of the troubled Chicago public school system. She was the 2016 winner of the Edward R. Mora Award for her radio reporting, as well as the winner of the Illinois Associate Press Award for her radio work at WBEZ. Sorry, Maribeth. So as I said, our moderator this evening will be Dr. Ryan Balch. Ryan is a senior lecturer at the Department of Leadership, Policy, and Organizations at Vanderbilt, and also coaches science teachers in MNPS through the Teaching and Learning Department. He completed his PhD in Education Policy at Vanderbilt University. Previously, Ryan was the director of teacher and principal evaluation of Baltimore City Schools, and before he worked as a science teacher. He has a BA in psychology from Duke University and an MA in science education from Georgia State University. Ryan, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you for having me tonight. So I'm really excited to talk with our guests tonight and be able to hear you all hear their great insights. So I've got a series of questions that I'll be going through and asking some of the panelists for a little bit. But we really want this to be a participatory type of conversation. So if you've got any questions you'd like to ask them or things that come up in parts of what they're saying, please just put that in the chat. We'll have a lot of time at the end to be able to answer those questions and so forth as we go. So go ahead. Any questions that are coming up, please drop them in there. So I'll start tonight with Maribeth. I wanted to start if you could provide an overview of what you explored on the Promise on the podcast for those that may be less familiar with it, and specifically also like what was the history that you learned about Warner Lockland and schools in East Nashville?
Let me first unmute myself. Hello. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here, and I feel really honored to have been asked to do this. So the promise generally as a theme of both seasons is stories about inequality. And the second season, which is about education, it really explores this question of how two schools ended up the way that they are today, which is Warner Elementary and Lockland Elementary. I came to those two schools after reporting in the neighborhood for over a year during the first season. And the thing that struck me was I felt like what I saw around me was that children were living in the same neighborhood and attending very different schools based on their race and their socioeconomics. And Warner, when I started reporting or when I came across it, was over 90% Black and over 90% economically disadvantaged. And Lockland was coming up on 90% white and just 6% economically disadvantaged. And they're just over a mile apart. And so when I saw these two schools as a reporter that explores race and inequality, I was just completely dumbstruck. I thought, how do two schools end up looking like this in a neighborhood that is almost evenly split between Black and white residents? And so that was really the impetus. That was the question that I sought out in this season of the podcast. I spent the year following Warner as it worked to turn itself around with a federal grant through the Magnet Schools of America program, which part of that, or really the main goal of that, is to integrate the school by boosting it up, beefing it up with more resources, and trying to recruit white families to reduce what they call subgroup isolation, which is just another word for segregation. And what did I learn? I learned that East Nashville is this really amazingly special neighborhood and holds kind of the keystone of the city's story of desegregation. I'm here in the present in the podcast, but we go back into history for 2 episodes where we learn that the beginning of Nashville's desegregation efforts started right in East Nashville when 20 Black families, one of them being the Kelly family, wanted to enroll in their neighborhood schools, which were white schools. They had been going across town to North Nashville to attend school, and they simply wanted to be able to walk to their school, and those schools were white. And when they tried to enroll in 1955, they were turned away, and they filed a lawsuit with the NAACP, along with the NAACP against the Board of Education. And that ended up being a 43-year saga of the city working to resist desegregation as those families and the lawyers fought for it. So East Nashville is a fascinating neighborhood because there's so much things that are butting up against each other in terms of wealth and poverty and Black and white. And I saw, wow, that's been happening for decades, for more than half a century, because it was one of the kind of rare neighborhoods in Nashville that had Black and white residents that lived somewhat close to each other, close enough that there were schools that were white-only schools next to where Black families lived. So was a really fascinating exploration. I learned so much about the city, about its history, and about the power that white families have yielded in education from the very beginning.
Great, thank you so much. Ricky, the next question is for you. What reactions have you seen to the podcast, and what conversations have you had with people that listen to it? And kind of to go beyond that, has it inspired any change that you have seen?
Yeah. Perfect. Appreciate you, Ryan. And thank you all for having me. I tell everybody, anytime we can engage in community conversations, it's always an honor and privilege to be a part of it. So we've seen a lot of positive interactions since the airing of the podcast when we talk about not only community support and thinking about some of the local businesses. I have to give a quick shout out to Sky Blue Cafe and Lachlan Table for how, two of the local businesses have just wrapped their arms around us, as well as Delgado Music, just finding ways to partner with local East Nashville businesses that, other than Sky Blue Cafe, that we, one, didn't necessarily know was in East Nashville, and two, had never interacted with. So we've been able to see positives that way. We've seen positives from just community members and potential families who the podcast, one, opened their eyes to not only the school, but some of the inequities of our community. And then just it gave those families a reason to not only give Warner a second look, or just some of them just give them a first look, and not even because they didn't know we actually existed. So it's been really interesting to deal with some of the positivity and how those interactions have happened. But I would say there are two conversations that hit the other side of the fence that have been really eye-opening and has really helped me begin to shape the way that I lead and the way that we interact with the community. One conversation is when I interact with some of the African-American community, and I get asked, well, Dr. Gibbs, why is it that you feel you need white families to be successful?
Yeah.
Why can't you do the work with only Black folks? Like, why can't you just create Black excellence? And part of that thought process is, and I tell people, please don't get it misconstrued. And you all can see, I am a proud African-American male. I stand 6 foot, 245 pounds, bald head, and a big smile. So like, I am proud. But when you look at the zip code that Warner sits in, 37206, it's 66% white. As Maribel said earlier, when she first started reporting, Warner was over 95% Black. Pretty much the majority of the Black families that are zoned for Warner, they already come to Warner.
Mm-hmm.
So we have all of those students already. If the school is going to thrive, if the school is going to continue to excel, because Nashville does student-based budgeting, the money follows the students. We must recruit, attract, and retain some of those white families that surround the school, or the school will just eventually run out of students to educate. Mm-hmm. You can't operate a school when you have 150 students. Financially, it just doesn't make sense to do that. So I began to enlighten people on that conversation. And then the second conversation that has been really interesting is when I sit down and have an honest conversation with some white families, and one lady just point blank told me, why should I risk my child's education by sending my child to your school? And this was one of the most fun conversations I've had in a while, because it was a sense of honesty that I can appreciate, because she was truly seeking to understand. And one of the things that I've learned in my reading, and I learned this from reading the autobiography of Malcolm X, when someone asked Malcolm X about being an ally in the work, and he replied, "We don't need your help." Years later, he reflected and said that was one of his missed opportunities, because he should have reeled them in. So I had this conversation, and part of the conversation was I told her, well, let's sit down and let's discuss what you would be really sacrificing. So when you think about Warner Arts Magnet Elementary that sits right in the heart of East Nashville, and like I told her, this isn't a Warner Lachlan conversation. This can be Warner against any school in the district, any public, private, or charter. Let's just go down the dynamics. We have dynamic teachers that are veterans. So you're not talking about teachers that this is their first year teacher. You're talking about teachers that have won Blue Ribbon Awards, Teacher of the Year Awards, District Awards. So we have the academic instructors in place. We offer dance in a full dance studio that teaches ballet, hip hop, tumbling, as well as jazz. Does your elementary school do that? We offer Spanish. Does your elementary school do that? We offer guitar, Chinese drumming, drama, and an art club. Does your elementary school do that? We offer We offer strings, and our boys and girls can learn how to play the cello, the violin, as well as the bass. Does your elementary school do that? So when we started talking about just going down the list of offerings, what we really hit on at the end of that conversation was the only thing you're risking is letting your child go to school with minorities and families that are economically disadvantaged. So you're risking your child understanding that everybody in the world isn't privileged. Everybody in the world doesn't look exactly like me. That is the only thing you're risking if you send your child to a school that's like Warner. So through that conversation, man, it was a beautiful conversation. It's been one of the most impactful conversations that I've had. And she's already committed to send her baby to Warner for kindergarten for next year. So when we talk about, but you can't engage in those conversations without the reporting that Maribel has done in the promise, because if it wasn't for the reporting of the promise, I never get an opportunity to sit down and have that conversation. So that's kind of the feedback that I've had. And those are two conversations that are probably the most impactful conversations that I'll be keeping with me for years to come.
Great. Thank you so much, Ricky. And this next question is for either of y'all. How unique are these cases, right? I mean, so how are unique have you seen in your, investigation or exploration into education or personal experience about, the Laughlin and Warner situation in terms of demographic contrast and proximity together, either in Nashville or in other locations in education? How common is this situation?
Oh, it's incredibly common. I mean, there's school districts all over the country that look exactly like Nashville. There are neighborhoods that look exactly like East Nashville. That was one of the things that I really wanted to communicate in the season, that and in a way was really nice to have something like Nice White Parents come out right at the same time. Like, here we have the same thing happening in New York City, which so many people think of as kind of this like totally different animal. And it is, but it's also happening in other cities all over the country. There's been amazing reporting by Nicole Hannah-Jones at the New York Times Magazine, who really put this issue on the map, which was that she looked at all of these cities where these desegregation cases had been settled and how quickly the progress had been undone and how quickly schools went back to the same segregated look that they had, in the 60s. I mean, I'll never forget in the early 2000s when I read a New York Times Magazine story about in Mississippi, how one school literally had a black prom and a white prom. Like, that was a real thing that was happening. This is happening all over the country. Nashville is no different than any other city. And these schools are a reflection of, a school system that was built on racial inequity. When public education started in this country, it was started as a segregated system. And so we will always be fighting against that. And so, yeah, it's unfortunately not an aberration at all.
Great. So Ricky, I'll ask you this question for the next one. What actions do parents take, either intentionally or unintentionally, that contribute to schools that are racially isolated, like the situation we're seeing that was described in the podcast?
Yeah. So when I think about actions, and I think about our implicit biases. We all have them. To say that you don't have an implicit bias one way or the other, you're being naive, because we all have them. Being ignorant of your biases is not okay. So that's what I tell people. It's you have to be aware, and that way you know how to adjust. So when I think about how parents play a role in intentional or unintentionally creating some of this, part of it happens with, I tell people, it's the lore of the story. We're all great storytellers, and me, I'm no exception. Part of my charm is that I'm a great storyteller. And what I've learned about telling stories and listening to people as I engage in conversations, nobody is concerned with the truth when the lie is more entertaining.
Mhm.
So you have parents who create these narratives about schools that they've never been in. They have no intentions of going in, but if they can create this story about how awful this school is, it gives them the power and gives them the comfort and the reassurance to make a decision that they already want to make, but they just need something to say, okay, this is why I'm making this decision. So they'll hear a story about a school, and we all know stories. There's probably some truth in it, but somebody has over exaggerated just to make it sound a little better. But they'll hear it and then they'll tell it to somebody else, who in turn tell it to somebody else. And now you have a neighborhood or a group of families in an area who decide, well, there's no way I'm gonna send my child to this school because they have terrible teachers, they have disrespectful students, they have poor leadership, and they've never seen either one of those things in person. So one of the ways that I tell people how it creates this divide, this gap, is because people are taking false narratives and they're just running with them. But again, nobody cares about the truth when the lie is more entertaining. But inverse, how do we intentionally correct this? Because I'm one of those cup half full optimists. Like I'm always excited about stuff. So how do we fix this? It's by doing the exact opposite. Take a tour. And I tell people that about Warner all the time. Is Warner the perfect school? No. Am I the perfect principal? No. But we're a loving school, we're a caring school, and we try to provide a great education to everybody that enters our doors. Okay. But you have to come and see it yourself. I tell everybody, if you come and visit and then you decide to do something else, I can live with that. But it's when families and people make a decision without being educated, without being informed, that you start sit back like, how is this happening? There's nothing else that we do as parents, as citizens, that will say, I'll make this life-changing decision for my child without having all the facts, without being well educated, without seeing it for myself. There's nothing else we do that. But when it comes to education, we go by hearsay and word of mouth so much rather than just coming and see it ourselves. So when we talk about how do you fix that, how do you get rid of that divide, how do you get rid of that inequalities? By challenging people to actually step foot in some of these same schools and see it for themselves before they make a decision.
Great. Thank you so much. Yeah. I love
Ryan,
it.
can I just add on to that really quickly?
Please. Yeah, this is now for you.
Okay. Great. Well, everything Ricky said is so true. From a reporter standpoint, I'm not an educator. I try to look around me and see what the landscape looks like and what the history was that came before. And one of the things that I was most struck by, well, two things. So one, on a very kind of like present, real note, there is so much kind of among white families in East Nashville, there is so much kind of momentum toward Lockland. I mean, there were many people that really considered it their zoned school, even though it actually wasn't their zoned school. When you look at real estate ads, it will say, this house is zoned for Lockland. That's inaccurate. It's not zoned for Lockland. You're in the priority zone for this school, but it's not your zoned school. So there's a real architecture and an infrastructure and a kind of momentum that starts to push white families toward a school like Lockland. And it really speaks to kind of how divided the neighborhood is, right? Because like those conversations never overlap enough for them to even understand that Warner exists, or that it is their zone school, or that, what the teachers are like. So there's that, there's kind of this architecture in play. But the other aspect of it, and I think is so important, is that in the history that I found, that I researched, I went back and poured over thousands of court documents from the 43-year case of the desegregation case of Nashville. white families were always threatening to flee, and then they did flee, and then the district went after them, and it really pulled the rug out from under the progress because white families were so steadfastly against integration. And it happened in multiple kind of rounds, as court orders would come in, as busing, the first court order around busing, a whole group of white families fled, and they fled to the fringes of the city where that was exempt from the busing order. And then the plaintiffs had a victory in the mid 80s where it was going to include the entire county, and then more fled out of the county. And so white families have always had this outsized kind of power, it's kind of the tail wagging the dog here. And when you look at how the district has catered to those families to try to keep them, they have a name for it. It's called recapturing. To get those families, they bent over backwards. And I think a very simple and kind of momentous moment for me in my reporting was when I asked the district for a very simple set of statistics, which was, in the boundaries of East Nashville, how many schools are there? How many elementary students are there? And how many elementary spots are there for students? There are so many schools in East Nashville. There are almost 3,000 more spots than there are kids. So that was a moment for me where I said, someone is being set up to fail. Some school is being set up to fail. Is Warner it? Possibly, because there's literally not enough kids to go around, because so many different kinds of schools have popped up, because so many versions of public education have popped up. And it's not an anti-choice thing that I'm saying. I'm just saying there is too much choice. And there's so much choice that there's literally not enough kids to go around. And when you have a student-based budgeting model like Nashville does, it means that you're setting some schools up to fail.
Great, thank you. It's interesting. You talked, both of you have talked about like, what are these, the potentially some of the choices, and Ricky, you really kind of spoke a lot to some of the bias about the narratives that we're going towards this. So I'm curious to hear what, most people in East Nashville would like to say that they're against segregated schools, right? But then they do many of the things. They tell the stories, they push the narrative that you just described. So what are parents telling themselves that allows them to really kind of justify these actions? Like, what do you think is the primary thought that's happening when you hold this, I do not like segregated schools, maybe I consider myself a progressive in that area, but I'm taking actions. How does that all sit? This is for either Maribel or Ricky.
So I'll start, Maribel, and then you can obviously jump in. It's funny, me and Maribel had this exact same conversation. And I had one of my, if you build it, they will come type monologues. And it's one that, and Maribel knows, and she has me on tape saying it. I don't blame families who made choices in years past. Warner has come a long way, and there's no way to hide that conversation, because it's part of the story. It's part of the excitement of where we've come from. There was a time when Warner had back-to-back years that multiple teachers quit in the middle of a school year, and students were left to learn from subs for half the school year. Who would want to send their child and put their child in that predicament? I can understand that. As an educator, I get that. There was once a time where, discipline was running rampant and students were getting suspended from school, being disrespectful to adults. There was a bit of chaos. I can understand if you said that was your reasoning because you wanted something else for your child. I get those things in years past. But when you look at the reality of now, and those things don't exist because we put structures and supports in place that help mitigate the level of trauma, mitigate the levels of anxiety that students have, and we've given them the structures and supports to be successful, then you have to ask yourself as a parent, now that you don't have those things, because back, a couple of years ago, that was justification, and rightfully so. That it's hard to argue with somebody, but now it's hard to find that same level of justification, and like you just have to have that honest conversation. I tell people it's not the most politically correct thing to say, but you have to have that honest conversation and say, I don't want my child going to school with poor minorities. Like that's the conversation. And if that's your honest truth, like I tell people, I don't ever hold judgment. Now, do I agree with that? No. Like I think that's ignorance. But like I can't hold that against you if that's how you truly feel. The worst thing we've done as educators and as a society is to ask people to give us their truth. And then when they give it to us, we shun them and we say, shame on you. But if that's the way you feel, that's the way you feel. But to have that conversation now, like we've taken those things off the table. So that's the only reason why you wouldn't do it, unless, if you want your child to have a religious upbringing and things of that nature in private schools. I totally get it. So part of it is just having those honest conversations with people, but families have had the excuses or reasons to make that decision in years past, but that's no longer the case.
Now it's a different kind of story that you need to be able to hit that reality with. So Minerva, did you want to speak to that?
Yeah. I think, from my perspective as a reporter, one of the most profound things that I witnessed was that somewhere along the way, as we try to do the very best for all of our children, we all want the best for our children. I'm a mother. I know I do everything I can for my son, but we've forgotten that public education is public education. It's not a private good, it's a public good, and that it takes stakeholders to make it work. As we've tried to apply some kind of free market or economics 101 policy to public education by allowing, the survival of the fittest or competition to weed out the weak, ones. It doesn't work like that, because everybody has to say, I'm going to work together to make this the best system possible for my child and every other child. Right. And I think that there's been so much catering to white families by public education and by the districts and by cities and officials that there is a lot of ignorance and unknown that white families have. They don't quite realize the power that they wield. So I'm not trying to point a finger, but what I did want to do with this series was try to inform those white families and say, you hold way more power than you realize. And you have to remember and be mindful of how you wield that power. And I think that it's just so critical to remember that we are all in this together. And there's a wonderful quote that Nikole Hannah-Jones says, and I use it in episode 4, where she says, until this country has racial equity, Black students will always have to be where white students are to get what white students get. It's very simple. I mean, I think that the magnet school grant that Ricky was working within, it was a wonderful infusion of money for the school. But the bottom line is that it was given to them with the promise and the hope of getting more white families. It was still tied to all those white families. And one of the things that I knew was going to happen, that I was so excited to kind of have this big reveal at the end, was that Warner did it all without getting any white families. They did it before they got those white families, but they did it because they had the resources attached to the promise of white families. And I think that that's so important to understand. As a white mom, after doing this, I just will never look at the system the same way again. I just know that I hold this power. And so I have to be judicious about how I use that. And I have to be really thoughtful about where my child goes to school, because that is actually going to impact other children, whether I know it or not. Whether I think I'm doing I just want to do the best thing for my kid. But now I look at every kid and I go, that kid could be my kid, or that kid could be my kid. And if I do something that's great for my kid, it actually could be detrimental to another kid. So I just wanted to put that out there, that I think we really have to reimagine public education, remember that it is a public good, and that we can't just keep trying to find loopholes in that system. We really have to work together to make it what we want it to be.
Great, thank you. And I've been seeing a couple of the questions. I want to step back and make sure we have time to address a couple of those. So first one was coming in was, Ricky, this one is for you, is just, how are your kids doing? Can you give us an update on how COVID has impacted them and how you're able to engage with them?
Yeah, that's Leslie's question. So
Mhm.
definitely. So it's really, I don't want to call it a hit or miss, but I would say 90% to 10%, because we have been doing school virtually as well as in person until a week ago when the district went back totally virtual. We've had about a 95% rate of contact in all of our families. We have been able to surround them with support. We've continued on with our partnership with Be Well in School, so we're still doing our mindfulness, our breath, and childhood yoga implementation, which has been huge. And I've had the conversation from the very beginning with folks and told them this was, yes, it's a proactive approach to discipline. And if I'm having a conversation on discipline, I can go into all the details and how it has totally been a game changer. But this partnership is really about dealing with anxiety and teaching students how to self-regulate in the midst of madness, because what we often hear, and it's one of my favorite quotes by Charlemagne the God, and he said that we have people making permanent decisions based upon temporary emotions. And we see that with children and we see that with adults. So we're teaching our boys and girls how to self-regulate. And in the midst of a global pandemic where trauma is everywhere, anxiety is everywhere, Maribel hit on it in the promise where the median household income in Casey is $12,000. So think about raising a family of 4 or 5 off of $12,000 a year. It's mind-boggling to us. But there's families that are doing that. And so obviously they need resources, they need support. So it's been exciting to see how not only our teachers and staff have reached out and gone over and beyond the call of duty, making home visits with their mask on, just calling folks, checking on them, texting them, and then just having the community wrap their arms around us with love. I mean, we just finished the Thanksgiving holiday, and obviously we're preparing for Christmas. So we have people, adopting kids with Angel Tree for Thanksgiving. Most people are used to doing food boxes, but we had a conversation with our partners at Lockland Table, and Kara, one of the owners, I was sitting talking to her, and I said, a food box would be amazing, but I have about 10 families who lights have been turned off recently, who you can't cook if you don't have lights. So giving them a food box, it's great, it's helpful, but that's not their need. So having that type of partnership, they decided, well, we're just gonna cook Thanksgiving dinner so those boys and girls can have a hot meal. So it's been exciting to see how we've been able to wrap our arms around families. But then there is the sad reality is there's still that 5% that we've gone by the house, they've moved, they're no show, no call. And because of how attendance policy works, once they reached a certain number of days of no show, no call, we had to drop them from our roll. Yeah. So we have about 8 to 12 students that we don't know where they are. They haven't enrolled into another school because we haven't received a call for a transfer for their documents. There's the parents either are not answering the call or the number has been changed. So you have a couple students like that your heart just aches for them, because those are the ones who definitely need the support of the school, who definitely needs that level of support wrapped around them, and we just can't get in contact with them right now. But that's the other part of the fence. But I'm excited that even in the midst of a global pandemic, about 90 to 95% of our students are still able to receive the level of support they need to be successful. So thanks for asking about our babies, Leslie. We appreciate it.
Well, I've got another follow-up question for you also. And so the heart of the question is just wondering, as a human, do you think you'll feel any sadness or bitterness once Warner is treated better and talked about better when you've brought in white students?
No, so that was the quote from Miss Moore, our most veteran teacher. And because Ms. Moore has seen it all. She's seen it when Warner was at its, doing really well. Then she saw the significant decline, and she's seen the upward trajectory that we're on now. I won't be sad, because that means the school is getting what it needs. It's one that in any situation, somebody has to bear the brunt of the burden to get to the promised land. Dr. Martin Luther King stood in front of millions of people and told us that I may not be with you when you get to the promised land, but I have a dream of this is where it's going to be one day. So when we think about just that work at Warner, and as we begin to recruit other families and diversify the school, no, I won't be sad, because I'm doing the work right now with the babies who are there. So I'm already guaranteeing that they are getting a great education. It's just the ones who come behind them will reap even more benefits. The exciting part is, even with just our babies from Casey that were in 3rd and 4th grade, or 2nd, 3rd, and 4th grade last year, we proved to everybody that they can do it, because on the MAP assessment, the measurement of academic progress that the district take, we were one of 12 schools that hit the district goal in literacy and numeracy for elementary and middle school. And you're talking about almost out of 100 schools, only 12 schools hit it in literacy and numeracy. And we were actually the #1 school in the entire district in numeracy at 78.9%. So we're excited, because we're digging into the work now, and we already see it. But if the school is truly going to thrive, if the school is going to truly be a reflection of the East Nashville community that it sits in the heart of, I tell everybody, it's not a replacement model that we're after. I want to keep all my babies from Casey, because they deserve a great education. I don't want them going nowhere else, because the next person may not love them as much as I do. So I want them to stay with us and get a great education. But I also want them to understand, everybody in this world doesn't live in poverty. Everybody doesn't live with concrete walls. I want them to meet and interact with boys and girls that don't look like them, who families have a different economic status than they do, because ultimately when they get out into the real world, they're going to have to learn how to interact with people that don't look like them, don't talk like them, don't believe as they do, don't love as they do. And that's what we're ultimately trying to get them ready for.
Yeah, and that bears out too. I mean, the research will tell us that, people that are attending schools with more desegregated schools tend to choose jobs in the future, and neighborhoods in the future that reflect a greater level of diversity too. From some of that comfort.
Can I just add on to that quickly, Ryan?
Yeah, please.
I just, from my perspective, I think that one of the, there are families in the Promise, like the Wood family. There are a number of them at Warner that are white families that have come, that are doing this work so mindfully, so thoughtfully. It is a really under-enrolled school. It could have twice as many kids. There is plenty of room for lots of white families to come there, but we have to do it mindfully. We have to do it mindfully. I think I'll never forget when I talked to one of the founders of Lockland, and, this was a group of very progressive parents in the early 2000s who wanted to build a new school that was going to serve their kids in the neighborhood, that their kids could walk to, but underneath all of that was this weird feeling that I got that they didn't want to send their kids to those neighborhood schools, but they were all very progressive, really thoughtful, smart people. But I'll never forget, I had a conversation with one of the founders, and he said, the secret sauce of Lockland was that we got to build it from scratch. And I never forgot that, because to me, that's one of the big things. We have to meet schools where they are. We can't build a school as a white privileged person in our image of diversity and then expect it to stay that way. It never will, because we have too many thumbs on the scale. So when I look at a school like Warner, I have really high hopes for it, because it's a neighborhood school. It's a zoned neighborhood school that has room for many different kinds of students. It needs more students, that will only help it thrive. And to have a group of parents that are mindful, that can meet the school where it's at and get in the groove of it, and not say, I'm going to take it over, I'm going to remake it in my image. That is what a school like Warner needs. And then the second part of that is that more principals need to be like Ricky Gibbs. Gibbs understands his students in a way that so many other people don't. I mean, Ricky came from poverty. Ricky grew up in neighborhoods like a lot of the kids that come from Casey, and he went to schools with kids that looked only like him. So he will always fundamentally get those kids and know how to talk to those kids, and those kids will feel comfortable and welcome in that school. And I can't say the same thing for Laughlin. I heard a lot of Black families who said, that's not a school for me. Why? I go and I don't see people that look like me. So it's a really delicate balancing act, but I think it can be done. And I think a big part of it is self-awareness and just mindfulness and cultivating the talent that can talk to the students that you want to keep and that you know need to feel loved and need to be supported in a way that other students might not. Like, it's just this kind of like delicate dance that you have to do. And Ricky's really remarkable at it.
Yeah. We need a lot more Rickies, definitely. So so a question that was coming in. So what are some of the city's policies, whether MNPS or the city, that continue to encourage school segregation that is exemplified by these two schools?
I can take that. I think that it's a long history of catering to white families. I think it's really on exhibit in episode 6, when we hear someone from MNPS say to a group of Laughlin parents, say, well, we have a solution for this right now, but no one's going to want it. We could just merge the two schools, but nobody wants that. And I just thought to myself, who is that nobody? You know, who are you really talking to? You're talking to the white families who you think will put up a stink. And so it's all of this kind of coded language and these subtle messages to parents that tell them, you're fine where you are, we'll make room for you, or we'll cater to you. I mean, I think another really profound example that I kind of come to the conclusion of in the last episode is Warner is benefiting so much from this magnet grant. It's been a game changer for this school, but it really saved it from the chopping block. And Ricky and all of his staff are bending over backwards to try to recruit white families to the school, to spread the message and to love and care about the students that they have right in front of them as well. And they have a really big job to do. Like, this is what brought me to the school. I was like, you have maybe the hardest job I've ever seen. You're trying to turn a school around, and you have big goals for it, because that's who Ricky is. He's a winner and he's going to win. And then you've got this other goal, you've got this other demand from the grant, which is get more white families in the door. Like, literally, if you don't do that, you're going to be in violation of this grant. Like, you got to do it. So he had this two-pronged kind of like mission that he had to like just hit the ground running on. And his school at that point, 90% Black, 92% economically disadvantaged. And then I turned to Laughlin, which is a blue ribbon school. It's doing amazingly well academically, but it's just as racially isolated, and it's just as economically isolated. And it is, from a reporter standpoint, when I tried to kind of probe that, when I try to understand that, it is a sacred cow. It is, don't touch that. That school's fine. We don't want to mess with that. It's not broken. And I'm thinking, it looks broken to me. There's something broken here. It's not working as it should for a public school. And so I think just even in that, right, even in we've got one school that's bending over backwards, doing everything they can to integrate, and another school that's literally the exact same demographics in the other direction is being held up as this, don't touch it, don't mess with it, it's fine. And so that to me was a very clear signal from the district of what their priorities were.
Yeah. And that resonates a lot with what you were saying about some of the other scenarios across the country too. So well, that's not unique. So I want to get to the next question, which is, how do you address white families? And this, Ricky, is probably a question for you about coming to your school. How do you address white families concerned they'll be the only ones if they choose your school? And then the opposite side of that, are you concerned that white families may flood your school trying to fix it, potentially ostracizing Black families who have been loyal to the school and work to improve the school over the years?
Yeah, so part of the exciting part is the process has already started with the integration. So quick numbers, Warner was projected for 197 students. And obviously in the middle of a global pandemic, people would expect that the numbers will go down. As of Friday, we're at 237 students. So we have grown almost 40 students, and it was at the 40 day of school count that we actually hired 2 extra teachers because our classes were overcrowded. We had the good part of recruitment and the excitement, people enrolling, but the bad part is that when they enroll out the projections, you have oversized classrooms until we can adjust. So the students have already started enrolling, so families don't have to worry about, will my child be the only one? Because as of right now, we're currently sitting at 78% African-American or 76%, somewhere up in that 78, 76, and about 11 to 15% white. And our Hispanic population is growing as well. So families don't have to worry about being the only one or the first one. They can shout out Heather Wood and some other families who have already gone before them. And then if you come see our kindergarten group right now, we have a lot of families who have already made that choice to enroll in kindergarten for this school year to make the school more diverse. So nobody has to worry about being, that first one, that pioneer. That has already happened as we look to and seek to diversify our school. But also we've had the conversation about, what happens when, I find it funny because it's other white people who use the term white savior, or what happens when all the white saviors come and flood the school. It's a funny term to me, but I get what they're implying. But one of the things that we've been intentional about, and this is one of the reasons that I've been really, really passionate about doing this work, is it's going to take a fine line, because you have families who have been at the school for multiple generations and have had students that the last 5-10 years and have seen when the school didn't have resources, and now that the school has certain resources, the difference of the two. And how do you not alienate some of those families? And a perfect example is in December, we started our first PTO. And it's the first time Warner's had a PTO in probably 30 years. And it's one of those situations that a lot of our newer families were excited about joining the PTO. Hey, I want to be president. I want to be vice president. I want to do this. And I sat down and had a real honest conversation with our team and said, hey, this is great that, a lot of our new families are super excited about PTO, but we must have someone on the PTO board who has had children here for multiple years, who can be that connector to the Casey community, can be that connector to families that have been here, so that our families don't feel disenfranchised. You have a whole community that already feels forgotten about that's in that Casey area, because Nashville is booming, Nashville is gentrifying, and they have been getting displaced. They just feel like the city is forgetting about them as the city continues to progress. So part of that conversation is being very strategic and being purposeful, but also not shying away from the conversation. And that's been how we've navigated to make sure that our new families feel welcomed. And even when they come do tours, I use the same quote that my pastor at the Temple Church, Pastor Daryl Drumright, uses. And I tell families, not only are you welcomed at Warner, but you're actually wanted at Warner, so that they know that, look, we cannot survive without you. Black, white, Hispanic, if you have a child, you are wanted because we want to educate all children. And at the same time, our families that have been there, hey, you're a necessity. We need you to continue to tell our story, because that's part of our excellence. So it's about making sure that we're communicating with both families, our new families, our present families, our past families, and even our future families, to let everyone know that when you come to Warner, it's about building a cohesive unit, because ultimately we're trying to make a better world for our children. And that's where the work has to come. It has to happen with the adults.
Ricky, I'm going to stay with you for one more question. There was a question that came in about.
Piggyback on that.
Go ahead, Maribel. Yeah, please go ahead.
I just want to, because from the perspective of like a white parent and a white woman and a reporter, I think that this question, I've gotten this a lot. You know, I don't want my white child to feel like they're all alone, or there'll be awkward social interactions, what have you. That's why I think it's so important to educate yourself about the history of desegregation, because when I sat down with the Kelly family and I listened to her stories and I read the stories of the Black families and the parents that put their kids literally on the front lines, walking through jeering mobs, throwing things at them, they did it to get their kid a better education. And they never once at least worried enough to say, what if my child is the only one? That was the point, that they needed to integrate these schools, and that statistics show schools, students will always do better when there is integration, when there is diversity. So this question of what if my child is the only one, when I went back and I educated myself on the history, and I hope people will do that and listen, that holds no water to me anymore. That's not an argument, because once you know what came before you and what Black families did to move the needle to get to a place of integration, you'll say, they've done it all before I have even thought of this. And the stakes were so much higher. So I want to encourage people to listen or to read and to understand the history, because while it is a valid question, when you understand the continuum of what Black families have done to push this issue forward, you will understand and you'll have a new perspective.
Great, thank you. Ricky, I want to ask you about, one element, a question that came in that I then clarified with him about test scores, right? So, when you're thinking about dealing with anxiety that parents have about test scores, and how do you convey your message that test scores are one part of education, but there are lots of other different parts? What does that message look like when you're explaining that to parents?
So it's actually a two-prong. I can tell you, I can give you the regular conversation, but then I'm gonna tell you the other part that I have a real conversation. So when we talk about test scores, and rightfully so, test, in the grand scheme of education, we know that if you look at any educational research, test scores tell you about social economics more than it tells you about instruction, which is some of the biases that exist in standardized testing. But I could go down that path, then parents would say, well, you're making an excuse because other schools are doing it. Rightfully so. So I tell my team all the time, part of our task is to put up points. I have a sports background. You can make all the throws in practice, score all the touchdowns, make all the shots. But if you're not doing it at game time, people will begin to question that. And that was one of the reasons that I believe it was episode 8. If you can tell, even by this conversation, this is the same way I talk to Maribel when we have interviews. Like I'm somebody I just be excited about life. My mom, my grandma told me a long time ago, anytime the Lord let you see one on this side of the dirt, you should rejoice. So I'm just excited about life, and I'm just this high energy. But I got into a real like funk, and it was one like Maribel called me, and I was like, man, look, I ain't even gonna lie to you. I've been avoiding your call because I ain't feel like talking. And I'm a talker. I love to talk. So it kind of it'll throw you off. But it was one that we were primed. We like to make it make sense to everybody. Every school gets a goal. So let's say our goal was 10%. Most schools struggle to reach that goal every year.
Mm-hmm.
Our double goal was 19%. 19 isn't double 10, but that the scores don't really just clearly double. So, well, that's neither here nor there. But the double goal was 19%. And it's unheard of for schools in the state of Tennessee to reach their double AMO, that double goal. We were on track to double the double AMO. So we were on track from going at a 9.7% success rate to being on track for a 46% success rate. Mm-hmm. At 46%, we would have gone from being in the bottom 5% of the state to the top 15% of the state. And all the projectors were showing us the same number. So when I say we were excited, like when we had the tornado and the start of COVID, I was like, man, send the kids to school anyway. Just let us take this test so we can put these numbers up. But because it's one that when families start to have that conversation about test scores, if you can't just give them hard test scores, or if you can always talk about the research, but if they're not someone that truly cares about the research, it's about, well, what's in front of me, then that's a hard conversation to have. So it's about really trying to find ways. And then now I just talk about other data points that show on average in the state of Tennessee, we use, if you follow schools, you hear people say TVAS. Educators, we love our acronyms. So TVAS is just the Tennessee Value Added Accountability System. So basically TVAS measures how well a school is growing students. So it doesn't matter if you're in the 7th grade, but reading on the 1st grade level. It's not saying that you have to be at the 8th grade level at the end of 7th grade, but you should be growing at an accelerated pace. So TVAS measures that. I can show you data that shows on average it's great if a school grows 1 year. For the last 2 years, Warner has grown 5.7 years. So we're talking about we're outpacing pretty much every school in the state. There's a document that came from the Department of Education that has just a bunch of dots on it. And you see Warner sitting out in a corner by itself because there's no school that has the level of economically disadvantaged students we have that's growing at the rate that we're growing. And even if you look at schools that don't have that kind of economically disadvantage, they're still not growing at that rate. So I began to have that conversation. But the true reality is we know through research that those test scores talks to you more about socioeconomics, but research is also clear. If you put a great teacher in front of a student, nothing else matters. Socioeconomics doesn't matter. Parental support doesn't matter. None of that matters if a child has a great teacher in front of them. So that's been our strategy. Let's take every excuse off the table. Socioeconomics, if you're hungry, we're gonna give you food because ultimately we're gonna put a great teacher in front of you. And now we're gonna see how the outcomes come out.
Thank you. And I know we are at the end of our time here, so I know there are a lot of questions that we're not able to get to in the chat. We'll try to answer as many as we can in the chat. But let me leave one thing. If you could have parents take one specific action after this session, what would it be?
Maribel, or community, you want to go first?
Not even just parents or community members.
I'll let Maribel go first and I'll bring it home.
One thing, Oh gosh.
One specific action.
Go visit your zoned school
Great.
and read a few books.
Yeah, I would say that the book, if you want to know a lot about the history of desegregation, you referenced it in your podcast, but The Making of the Unequal Metropolis. It's a doozy to get through, but if you can, it is incredible history that gives you a lot of context about Nashville as well. So, Ricky, what would you like to leave us with?
All right. So Maribel obviously took mine of visiting school. I think it's just huge. You can't make a decision without actually visiting. But then I would also say help control the narrative. Oftentimes our schools are put at a disadvantage because we are telling that negative narrative in our communities. Again, I'll remind you, nobody cares about the truth when the lie is more entertaining. So why tell that exciting lie when you can, once you take Maribel's suggestion and go visit the school and see all of the amazing things that are happening in our public schools, then you go and share that tale. So you can start with Maribel and then you can finish with me. You go visit the school and then you tell a friend who will tell a friend. It doesn't matter. And I tell people that want to come visit Warner all the time, I don't care if you have school-age children. You can be a grandma. They can call you Nana, Papa, Big Mama, Big Daddy, or you can be, Auntie Beth. It don't matter. Just come visit, because you're going to tell somebody, and that somebody will tell somebody who has a child, who will then give the school a second look. So I always start with visiting your neighborhood schools. But then once you see those amazing things, don't feel like you got to keep that secret to yourself. Share.
Yep.
And as you share, others will share. And then when people start hearing about our schools, they'll view our schools in a different light as we continue to dig into this work.
Well, thank you both. Ricky, thank you for just the incredible work that you're doing. And I can say for all the folks on the call, this is how Ricky is on every single conversation, because he and I get to work together on the Educators Cooperative together, which is wonderful. So it is true. And Maribel, thank you so much also for your work and shining a light on great work and also what direction and how far we do still the work we have left remaining. So thank you both for your work in contributing to public education. So, Mikhail, I'll turn it back over to you.
Sorry for being silent. It was fascinating. Thank you, Maribel. Thank you. Can you see me? I don't know.
Yep.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, Maribel. Thank you, Ricky. And thank you, Ryan. That was amazing. I know we still have a lot of questions. I might send it to you guys on email and see if you can answer them. And yes, thank you everyone for joining us in this late hour on Sunday night. And I hope to see you again. Bye.